Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Mackenzie Bean with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel on the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. In about a week following the webinar, we will be sending all registrants a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. Please be patient as a post-webinar preparation of materials can take some time. It is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our panelists. Chairman and co-founder of C-Suite Resources, Don Wegmiller has an expansive healthcare industry resume that spans 35 years. Mr. Wegmiller developed and served as CEO of the Alena Health System for 15 years, one of the Upper Midwest's largest integrated systems. He went on to serve as CEO and later chairman of Integrated Healthcare Strategies, the nation's largest healthcare executive compensation consulting firm. He has served as chairman of the American Hospital Association, the organization's highest elective office, and has led many other healthcare organizations. Don currently serves as chairman of Scottsdale Institute, a healthcare information technology collaborative, holds policy positions in state and national healthcare associations, and has served on the boards of more than 20 publicly held corporations over the last 20 years. He currently serves on the boards of 3 public companies and 2 company advisory boards. Don received his bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Britta Hansen is Chief Medical Officer at LogicStream Health. Dr. Hansen is also a practicing internal medicine hospitalist and has served as a healthcare system executive, most recently as Chief Health Information Officer at Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. Prior to her role as CHIO, Dr. Hansen spent many years in quality improvement as the Medical Director of Inpatient Quality and Informatics at HCMC. She is also an Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Minnesota School of Medicine. Dr. Hansen graduated from New York University with a Bachelor of Arts in Biochemistry before going on to the University of Minnesota Medical School, where she received her Doctorate of Medicine. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Don to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Mackenzie. It's a pleasure to be a part of the Becker's seminar and to participate with Britta. So if we could get the next slide, this will tell us what kind of issues we're looking for. So Maggie, next. These are the 4 key issues and then a wrap up of other key issues that we're going to try and cover today in the allotted time, plus a few takeaways that you might look at as far as these issues are concerned. Next. First of all, the tax healthcare implications. The tax reform bill had a number of implications. Next, Maggie. First of all, of course, most noteworthy to healthcare is the elimination of the individual mandate, which was part of the Affordable Care Act, which, according to Congressional Budget Office, will mean another 13 million will be uninsured. So we'll wait and see. If that is the case, obviously, providers of healthcare are going to be impacted by additional uncompensated care. The hoped for provisions by a number of senators for stability issues in the insurance market, particularly in the individual insurance market, did not take place. Payments to insurers for deductibles, the cost sharing reductions of the Affordable Care Act, also were not included in the tax reform bill as hoped. Reinsurance to a number of states who have put together a plan to lower premium increases also did not make the cut in the final tax reform bill. What did occur, however, unfortunately, for providers is there is a $25 billion cut in Medicare funding, and that's going to be spread out over lower payments to doctors, hospitals, nursing homes, other providers. Another $1 billion cut, in addition to the budget reforms, to CDC funding was included in the tax reform bill. And finally, and not very positively, the elimination of tax-exempt debt refinancing for hospital debt was included. And this is only applicable to a refinancing. New financing of debt is still available to not-for-profit organizations. So those are some of the implications of the tax reform bill. Next. The first key issue, in addition to the tax reform bill that we just discussed, is the implications of consolidation. Yes, we're all aware. Let's look at the next slide, Maggie. We're all aware that hospitals have consolidated into systems for quite a while, but now the systems are consolidating and, frankly, moving into mega systems. Here's a chart that was developed by Deloitte. We assisted them in developing this. In 2014, this was their analysis of the health system landscape. And over the last 4 years, this has progressed with larger numbers at the top of the chart and smaller numbers at the bottom. But you can see at that time that they counted 80 large or national chain systems and another 273 mid-tier systems, 2 to 9 hospitals. Next slide. The movement of this, they projected by 2024, or only 10 years after their early projection and only 6 years from now, would basically see all of the hospitals, the 1346, be part of an existing system. So the 487 systems would grow to 926, projecting that basically there wouldn't be any independent hospitals. I think that directionally that's probably correct, but mathematically it isn't likely that all independent hospitals will move into systems. Next. The system-to-system merger or consolidation has continued from its start about 5 years ago. Here are some examples of them, but just a small sampling. Some of the more recent ones we'll show next on the next slide. These on the slide that's coming is the systems now moving to mega systems. Dignity Health and CHI, Catholic Health Initiatives, have announced their merger into a 139 hospital system with annual revenues of $28 billion. There's a good deal of talk in the industry, not from Providence, but about Providence, St. Joseph, and Ascension, that they are beginning discussions of putting their two systems together. Neither of those organizations has confirmed those discussions, but were they to occur, this would create the nation's largest health system, either not-for-profit or for-profit, with $45 billion of annual revenue. And what has been announced and just got two-state approval is the merger of Advocate in Illinois and Aurora Healthcare in Wisconsin, creating another large system. Next slide. So as a result, currently the top 100 systems now represent the majority of all expenditures in the provider sector of healthcare, 51% back in 2012. That number now is probably closer to 55 to 56% of all expenditures, labor, supplies, equipment, anything that is spent in the provider sector. 100 systems represent about 50+% of all expenditures. So this has some major implications to anybody selling into or buying in healthcare. Next slide. So just looking at that one key issue alone, here are some of the things that we believe are implications of those issues. First of all, it's hoped that with this consolidation of systems, that what will accelerate is the integration within those systems. Because the system without integration is essentially just a collection of independent hospitals. However, clearly, systems have become the dominant form organizationally for hospitals, which challenges the remaining independent hospitals in a number of ways. They're now growing from local to regional. There's a few national, and on the surface, there appear to be more national chains that are looking to be put together. Systems are also acquiring, expanding ambulatory networks such as urgent care, freestanding emergency departments, and so on. What it means is that there are fewer buyers because most of these systems consolidate their buying into a single supply chain. And they're now moving to centralize other services. So as is indicated by the spend, 100 systems purchasing 50% of all of it, this is likely to continue as the consolidation continues. If you're selling into a provider organization, a system, you'll find that that sales cycle is lengthened. There are a number of additional people now weighing in on whether that purchase should occur or not. And there's a lot more influencers and recommenders that a seller has to deal with. And the size of the agreements, of course, are larger if you're purchasing for 10 hospitals versus 1, but they may pilot some of those purchases at 1 or 2 hospitals. Next slide. Next one. The vertical integration that has been occurring is accelerating as well. When the big 5 insurance companies decided that they wanted to consolidate down to 3, but the Justice Department did not approve, they took a different tact and decided to move into purchasing provider-type organizations. Of course, United and the purchase of DaVita is a well-known example, but it followed an equally large purchase of surgical care affiliates, a nationwide system of ambulatory surgical care centers. That was followed fairly quickly and recently by CVS purchasing Aetna. In this case, the provider of healthcare, CVS, purchased the insurer, but the net result is the same, and that is bringing together insurance plans and providers of care is a new integration, the typical vertical integration, but it's starting off in a very big way. Next. So from this, we can pretty well conclude that the increasing scale of systems on both sides, provider, insurer, is being done to gain market power. This challenges, of course, community hospitals, independent hospitals, and with academic medical centers seeing this trend, they are now becoming part of systems. In New Jersey, the 2 medical centers there have become part of systems. In Minneapolis, University of Minnesota Hospital has become a part of Fairview organization, and in Phoenix, Banner Health has acquired the entire health center of the University of Arizona. So the vertical integration is the next wave of consolidation, and we think that's going to have many implications to providers. The key to remaining competitive for many of these systems is to now begin to work on clinical effectiveness, because without that, again, you are merely just a collection of hospitals. Next. Next, the hospital system's finances have been suffering for the last number of years. The chart here shows the decline in margins just from Medicare, a decline of about 13 margin points over the last 15 years. Right now, the calculation by the American Hospital Association is that Medicare pays about 88% and Medicaid about 90% of the actual costs of patient care. Next. Both of the rating agencies have indicated that they believe that the outlook for providers' finances are negative. So let's look at some of the other key issues. The providers are looking at a significant shortage of practicing physicians. Right now, the U.S. has the lowest percentage of practicing physicians per thousand population of any industrialized nation. Most of the nations are at 4 or 5 physicians per thousand. The U.S. is 2.1, a significant issue. Population health management is another key issue. It's of great interest. Many providers are engaged, but a payment source for those expensive care management systems is still not available. There's 106 provider-led health systems, the large systems owning or managing their own health plan, and the longer tenured ones are the most successful. They now enroll about 15% of Americans in these provider-led health plans. A lot of talk about value-based payment models increasing, but it's very slow. Insurers are very reluctant to share premium revenue, and therefore it's still built around a fee-for-service payment model. Rural hospitals, for lots of the reasons that we've already talked about, are suffering increasing stress, 44% of them now operating in an annual loss. A part of everybody's cost structure, which has rocketed upward dramatically, is pharmaceutical costs. There's far outstripping inflation, even medical inflation, by 2 to 3 times every year, and there doesn't appear to be any control in sight. Next. So some of the takeaways from this quick look at key issues are that clinical process improvement has got to be a part of lowering our costs, certainly is a part of improving the quality of our care and the quality of outcomes, and the ability to have a standardized clinical improvement structure across systems. The upcoming financial challenges and the existing ones will certainly be a problem for lots of organizations that serve the industry, vendors, suppliers. However, it may be an opportunity for those to help improve operations, which is key, just like clinical process improvement. The consolidation is widely viewed of providers as both a blessing and a curse, and that's true for vendors and suppliers. The sales may be larger individually, but the number of buyers is much smaller, as we showed in the slide regarding the top 100 systems. And the future of vertical integration certainly appears to be the trend. Of course, we've all read a little, not a lot, about the upcoming put together of a not-for-profit provider by Amazon, by JP Morgan, and by Berkshire Hathaway. We don't know what that means because we don't know where they want to enter the industry, but certainly it's another example of integration, in this case, of healthcare buyers. So we'll wait and see what that means. But it's likely that others will link with insurers to create large providers. One who has been in that business is United Healthcare's Optum subsidiary, which is now a $150 billion company on its own, separate from the insurance part of United Healthcare. Next. Let me turn the slides now over to Britta, who is going to tell us a lot about how the clinical priorities are proceeding. Britta?
All right, thank you so much, Don. That was really interesting. Maggie, we can move on to the next slide, please. So it looks like we're facing a lot of challenges that Don has outlined, and I hopefully want to pivot here to look at some of the opportunities we have to address those challenges. So I'd like to look at this from the lens of those of us who are kind of at the front lines of healthcare, who are doing the work of care delivery and clinical improvement work every day, and look at this landscape of macro trends and how we might take tangible steps to address some of these issues. So in the big picture, Don mentioned this concept of clinical effectiveness, and more all of these things that are putting pressure on us are going to continue to move us towards needing to demonstrate clinical effectiveness. And I've really come to believe that at the heart of all of this is the clinical process itself, the way we actually deliver care every day. And this is one of the big keys to addressing the biggest challenges we're facing. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So underlying a lot of what we've been talking about already is that there's just simply too much unnecessary variation and just outright waste in healthcare. And we need to be doing better at supporting our clinical teams and helping to identify and then eliminate any care processes or process steps that are ineffective or inefficient. And only by doing so are we going to be able to actually achieve the results that we want to achieve. So let's talk a little bit about how we might do that. Next slide, please. So we've all heard a lot in recent years about the promise of big data and all the benefits we should be reaping from our EHRs. But as we all know, we really continue to be lacking in immediate practical applications, or what we often call actionable insights. So here I'd like to just acknowledge the fact that that phrase, actionable insights, is used a lot. And I think we use it a lot because we're all facing the same frustrations, that we're kind of sitting on these seas of data that we don't know what to do with. But I want to say that when I'm using this phrase, actionable insights, I again think that this is a place where the clinical process itself is key and can actually help us to make the insights we have much more actionable. So by saying that, I mean we need to really be able to show clinicians not only how they're doing, such as in terms of their clinical outcomes, but what they're doing as they deliver care every day and what they can do to improve. So things that are actually under their control. So often we tend to focus on clinical outcomes, and of course these are important. We need to continue to aim for those. But it can be very disempowering to clinicians if they're held accountable to these clinical outcomes, but really have no power and nothing actionable they can do about it. So we often have these examples we see every day of providing our clinicians, specifically physicians, with some sort of scorecard about their performance. And usually these are very heavy on performance metrics, so things like sepsis mortality, surgical site infections, et cetera, that we present to them on a scorecard. But I would say these outcomes are really rarely tied back to the actual steps in the care process that are leading to those results. So while we're increasingly practicing medicine in teams, and we recognize that there are many individuals on those teams and many separate actions or inactions that are leading to the results that we're getting, we still continue to judge performance at the individual level based on outcomes. And I really think this is a big problem, and why we so often get mired down in questions of attribution, or we start to focus on exceptions to delivering standard care instead of the rules. So here I would say I think it's incredibly important to pull this all up a level and instead start focusing on the entirety of the clinical process itself and doing what we can to understand and improve those processes and then ultimately control them over time. So next slide, please. So this slide is starting to demonstrate that I think we need to be looking at our clinical processes different. In order to truly understand what's going on in our clinical processes, we need to start leveraging all this data we're sitting on in a new way. So here I've illustrated that I think we have three separate unique data sets that we need to be bringing together in order to understand what's going on. So first is the data about the actual steps in the clinical process. The second is about patients to whom the steps apply, and the third is the clinicians who actually carry out those steps of care delivery. So while this model here looks quite simple, I would say that we really do not analyze our clinical processes in this way. We don't have an easy way to bring these three separate data sets together, especially not in a way that's kind of scalable over all the work we're doing. So just a little in depth about each of these. So first, the process steps themselves. So our EHRs have a tremendous amount of data about what we're doing every day, the individual steps we're doing as we deliver care. So a lot of our care initiates with physician or provider ordering. We have all of that data. There's also a lot of data about other decision points we're making along the way, whether it's how we respond to alerts or answer questions or document things. But it's, again, rare that we bring all of these points together and use it to fully understand our complete care process. So second is the group of patients themselves to whom the process applies. And here I do think we also need a slightly different mindset. And kind of historically, as we've done quality and improvement work, we've done a lot of focusing on individual patients and individual cases. So while we're, as Don mentioned, we're looking more and more at population health issues, and we're starting to look at patients and populations, I would say that, that mindset of looking at individual patients and cases is still deeply entrenched in how we do our work every day. So I'm sure many of you can relate to the fact that we continue to rely on doing kind of deep chart reviews or chart excavation in order to do our improvement and quality work. And here I would argue that, again, this is really pulling us off course and getting us mired down in questions of attribution and looking for exceptions rather than following a standard care process. So finally, a word about the clinician group. These are, again, the people who are carrying out the steps every day. And I have found it particularly helpful that when we're looking at improving our processes of cares, that we're looking at our clinicians within the context of their peer group and really defining a meaningful comparison group so that we can look at practice patterns and variation in that context. And I would say most clinicians really do not get to see this type of information about their practice. The ability to be able to compare how you practice medicine every day with groups who have a similar practice. So I'll share some examples of this next. Next slide, please. So as we all know, kind of underlying a lot of the things we've been talking about, the big trends and challenges, is this continuing rise of healthcare expenditure in our country. And unfortunately, much of it just being driven by wasteful spending. So I'm going to focus in on a couple of areas here where I think that clinical process can and should be playing a key role. So this slide here is showing a graph that was originally published in 2012 in JAMA. I'm sure many of you have seen this or some version of it before. It's essentially showing a projection of where wasteful healthcare expenditure will lead us in the next upcoming years if we are to continue on business as usual course. But even more so than the projections that are in this slide, I think this paper was very instrumental in outlining a model of what is driving the wasteful spending in our country. So it defined all of these categories or wedges that you see on the slide. And this is really starting to provide us a context in which we can start to tease out the details of what exactly is driving that excess spending in our country. So again, I think clinical process plays a huge role in two of these categories, probably in more, but I'm going to focus on two of them. So the first is that top category, which is the failures of care delivery, and the second category is overtreatment. And I'm going to focus on these in the upcoming slides. So just first, some definitions. Failure of care delivery refers to the lag between the development of best clinical practices and their adoption. So we know we need to accelerate this. And I think we can be doing better here by ensuring that the content in our EHRs and the workflows they're driving are aligned with the best clinical practices and not doing the opposite of driving outdated practices. And again, back to the model of the data types, I think there, again, we have a lot of data that we're sitting on here, and we could be leveraging this data from our EHRs to be doing much better. However, I think most of us have experienced that attempting to do that has been not easy to do and very time consuming. So I'll share some examples of how we've been able to help our customers do that. Secondly, the category of overtreatment is really referring to the high volume of low value or no value or just flat out inappropriate care that we are collectively delivering. So we'll go on and talk some more about that as well. Next slide, please. So we're all coming to work every day with the intention of delivering the highest quality care we can and keeping our patients safe. But in order to meet those goals, we really need to start attacking that category of failures of care delivery. Unfortunately, I do think that there are some keys to success we're learning here and some ways that we can actually intervene and do better in this area. So I'm going to outline these on a slide here. So the first is the concept of gap analysis. And the gap I'm talking about here is the gap between the care delivery processes that we actually have in place and are actually doing every day and what we want to be doing, the things that we know that the best up-to-date guidelines are driving. So unfortunately, we find that despite our good intentions and doing a lot of work in this area, that most health systems have multiple areas that they have this type of gap that exists. And this is what I've had some experience of being able to work with health systems in trying to eliminate. So I have many examples of this, but one that's kind of top of mind I have listed here. So fairly recently, my team and I were working with a health system, and as we sat down, we with the intention of starting to tackle this type of gap analysis, we asked them to start with an example of a project they had recently completed that they felt that they had pretty standardized already. And they said that they had just finished a care redesign of their VTE prophylaxis program or their blood clot prevention. So they did what many of us have had experience doing before. They brought together a multidisciplinary team. They examined the available evidence and the quality measure specifications. They designed kind of the workflow and the EHR content that they wanted to drive the standardized practice, and then they implemented it and trained all their staff to it. So when we sat down with them to do this analysis, we found that yes, indeed, they did have this updated way of doing it. But unfortunately, that new way was sitting on layers and layers of old content that they had in their EHR. So when we did the analysis, we found they actually had 78 different ways that clinicians could choose to address VTE prophylaxis. And by 78 different ways, I mean they had 78 different order sets or order groups or care plans, different choices that clinicians had. So that is just the very definition of unnecessary variation in care. We can see how that's just driving excess complexity and waste and really causing a lot of confusion and frustration for clinicians. So the second point here is that we need to not only understand what is going on, but the who. And again, that's back to the idea that we need to be able to bring those three data sets together as we're doing this work. But we also find that it's pretty common that there may be users within or clinicians within your organization who are involved in a workflow that you were not even aware of. A recent example we found of this at a health system was in their labor and delivery workflow. So it turned out that they had recently done some redesign of their care plans for women presenting in labor and had trained everyone to them. But for some reason, they were continuing to see gaps. It was only when we were able to help them with that analysis, again, looking across those different areas, that they were able to identify that there were actually some emergency room nurses who were involved in the care of some of the labor and delivery patients, which was unexpected. So ultimately, they were able to dig into that further and find that there was some confusion when women were presenting about where they would go to register that was leading to kind of an unnecessary pit stops in the emergency department, and they were able to tighten up that workflow and eliminate that confusion and get the result that they wanted. So finally, here is the concept of directly targeting unnecessary variation. So when we start to illuminate practice patterns and our common goal is to drive out the variation itself, then it can be very freeing and moving us away from kind of the finger pointing and blaming we often see and start to look at the variation itself as the common enemy. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of examples here on this slide. So the first example is a project that I personally worked on quite extensively. It was a project I led many years ago. And even though it's several years old now, I like to share this example because it was so illuminating to me and my team at the time. So in this case, again, it's a VTE prophylaxis project or a blood clot prevention. And we were working with our surgical services at the time, all the different surgical groups, and we set out to have a standardized care process. So in the very beginning, we decided to do an analysis of what our current state was to really start to define what kind of variation do we have in our practices right now. And so as you can see from this graph, the answer was that we had a lot of variation in our practices. So not to go into too much detail here, but you can see that by the different colored bars on the slide, that there are a few different ways that clinicians can choose to address VTE prophylaxis, and we had quite a bit of variability across our surgical groups. And as we talked to our clinical leaders, we quickly realized there's no clinical reason for that much variability, and it was very eye-opening to us to see this. We had never seen our practice patterns in this kind of format before, to really truly look at what kind of variation we were facing in our practice. And again, this led us away from finger pointing and blaming any individual clinicians, but got us all rallied behind the common goal of targeting the variation itself. And that's exactly what we did as we set off on a journey of standardizing our care around this. And we had some great success with it. And I think it also allowed us to set a framework for all of our future improvement activities that collectively we were for getting rid of this kind of variation. The second example on this slide is similar. It's in a different organization, and it's a CAUTI prevention, or a catheter-associated urinary tract infection prevention program. And what this organization was doing was first looking at utilization of urinary catheters, because obviously the more catheters you use, the more likely you are to get complications from them. So when they started out, they again saw that they had tremendous variability in utilization, and the different lines here represent different hospital facilities within a larger organization. So ultimately, this is exactly the type of graph we want to see over time. We want to see that the variation itself is being squeezed out over time. And in this case, this did translate not only to decreasing the variability, but they were also able to realize a 30% reduction in their CAUTI rate. Next slide, please. So finally, as we look at that other category of tackling over-treatment, one of our priorities should be to actively work to decrease inappropriate utilization. So again, this is a place where we need to recognize that our EHRs and the clinical processes they drive have a tremendous impact on how we're delivering care and how we often are delivering inappropriate care. It's unfortunately common that we are inadvertently making it too easy for clinicians to do the wrong thing. So whether it be that we have things that we don't want to be ordered or only to be ordered in certain clinical settings, they are often found in order sets, perhaps in places that are not appropriate. When we present clinicians with lists of choices, if we have them presented first in a list, that can often drive unnecessary utilization. And in some cases, we even find that these things are pre-selected in choices that clinicians face. And all of these can have a tremendous impact on driving the way we practice. And so if there are things we are trying to minimize or to ensure they are only used in select situations, we really need to be careful about where we're placing those throughout our health records. And then secondly, for the overall goal of decreasing inappropriate utilization, again, looking at practice patterns within the context of a meaningful peer group can be particularly powerful. So there are two examples here. The first is an example of a lab test, and this particular lab test happens to be CKMB, which, not to get into too much detail, but in most clinical settings, this is a pretty obsolete test. So we really don't want to see much use of this across health organizations. So in this particular organization here, they were able to identify that they were indeed driving inappropriate utilization simply by the way that they had their EHR configured, that they were just making it too easy to order this test, and oftentimes kind of suggesting that clinicians order that test. So by making some fairly easy changes, we can target a lot of this low-hanging fruit and decrease utilization without even starting to go on to the next harder step of practice and change management. And so actually in the CKMB test here, so these very simple changes they made, they actually were able to save $120,000 a year just in that one test. In the second example here, this is a medication example, and this is actually IV acetaminophen or Tylenol. So this is, again, a medication that tends to be very overprescribed. It's relatively expensive, especially in comparison to its oral counterpart, which is no less effective. So it's often a great place to target to get rid of some unnecessary cost. So in this case, we see we're looking at one particular group of providers within a healthcare organization. I believe this is a group of hospitalists. And you can see again at the beginning of their intervention period, they found tremendous amount of variability. And again, just by being able to present this data about their practice to the clinicians, they were able to see a dramatic decrease in the variability of prescribing habits and bring everyone into a range that they felt was a reasonable amount of prescribing of this medication. So this particular project had significant financial implications. So by just targeting this one medication, this organization saved $120,000 a month from doing this. And I also just want to make note here that, you know, when I'm talking about these savings, these are simply the savings of the thing itself, whether it's a single test or a single medication. So this isn't even counting all the downstream implications of ordering the wrong thing or the inappropriate thing to begin with. We know that oftentimes one inappropriate order leads to a whole cascade of downstream costs. So one positive test leads to more testing or leads to more procedures or leads to more medications being prescribed, longer length of stay while we're waiting for all these test results, not to mention any complications or side effects we see from doing this. So we can see that even, you know, looking at the cost savings that I talked about already is just the tip of the iceberg, and we have tremendous opportunity if we start tackling this overutilization. Next slide, please. So to end here, really, if we're looking at delivering highly reliable and high value care, we really need the ability to understand and to standardize and control our processes of care delivery. So I do think we're sitting on a wealth of data that, while a lot of times can be overwhelming, we do have tremendous opportunity to leverage and actually make into actionable and timely insights. And if we do that, we can actually provide our clinicians and the clinical teams and our improvement teams useful information about not only how they're doing, but what they're doing and what they can actually do to improve. So with that, I hope this has been the start of a useful framework to frame this discussion. And I think that Don and I can start to take some of the questions that are coming in.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Hansen and Don, for such a fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for. So Dr. Hansen, let me direct the first question to you. What are the top 2 or 3 requirements for health systems when it comes to improving clinical process and effectiveness?
Yeah, thank you. So again, back to the concept of kind of the data types, I think first and foremost, you need to be able to understand all of those aspects of the clinical process. So not only the individual care steps in the process, but the patients to whom they apply and the clinicians who are doing that work. So first and foremost is to be able to analyze those together. The second is that we need to be able to give that information and put it in the hands of the people who need it to do improvement work or lead the care teams who are delivering this care every day. So that means it has to be easy to use, and we can't rely on our IT and analytics teams to be able to keep up with the demand for this kind of information. So if we make it really easy for them to use and give it to them in a very timely way, I don't think that this information needs to be in exactly real time, but it has to be pretty darn up to date so we can know what is care delivery like in our organization today. And then finally, I would say that it really needs to be scalable across initiatives. So a lot of times we look at improvement activities in a very verticalized way. So, we're doing CAUTI prevention today and sepsis prevention here. Instead, I think we need to be able to expose the entirety of our care processes in a way that's scalable across everything we're doing.
I think that is a great point. Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Mm-hmm. Don, it looks like this next question is for you, and it says, based on your conversations with the C-suite, what are the highest priorities for today's CEOs and CFOs? Is it cost reduction or maybe improved patient care or clinician burnout?
Well, certainly cost reduction is always, and it is today, high importance in the C-suite. When you continually see the figures of the cost of care now approaching 18% of our gross domestic product, and hospitals representing about 30% of that spend, anything that can be done. And I think, by the way, Britta gave some great cost savings examples by clinical process improvement. I mean, when you think of $120,000 a month, that's pretty sizable. So cost reduction is clearly a major priority of most C-suites. But in addition, obviously, other things impact the C-suite other than just cost. One, of course, is being able to continue to attract physicians because we are in a shortage of physicians. And so the whole issue of recruitment and retention of care providers, notably physicians, notably nurses, but that whole area is of great importance. Now, there are a lot of people involved in that recruitment retention process, but it is definitely on the radar screen of C-suites. A third is undoubtedly this whole movement towards both consolidation and integration. those two need to be linked together a great deal. And all of the impacts, whether that's how do we create a strong, integrated, single supply chain, is an example of something that rises to the C-suite's attention and importance. Because acquisition of supplies represent about 18 to 20% of total operating costs. So anything that you can do when it represents 1/5 of your cost of operation is important. I'd say those are the three that really stand out today as important to the C-suite. There are many more, of course.
Great. Well, thank you for expanding on that, Don. The next question is, do you believe that EHRs have a defined process and event model that can be analyzed to drive these actionable insights? And whoever wants to take that, feel free.
I can take it. So, again, as I said, I think the EHRs are enabling us to collect a lot of this data. But, really the main focus of an EHR is to support, one-to-one patient care, so clinician and patient interactions, and it does a great job at that. And I have just found it tremendously difficult to leverage the data that we have there to actually look at the entirety of the care process in the way that we described. I do think, most health organizations have very robust analytics teams, and they can, in certain circumstances, kind of pull that data out to be used. But it is very labor intensive. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this tends to not be a scalable solution. So I guess ultimately, I don't think we have a current state where the EHRs kind of support the ability to really measure and control and improve our clinical processes.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Don, let me turn to you now. Another audience member says, recent press indicates that getting bigger isn't necessarily improving cost and quality of care. Could you comment on that?
Well, I think the operative term there was recent press. I think that's true. The press clearly doesn't, and regulators clearly don't believe that there is that. However, there are some studies. Thrubin did a study last year where they took a set of system organizations and a set of community hospitals and compared their outcomes across 7 metrics. And systems outperformed independent hospitals in this one study on all 7 of the metrics. So that isn't the kind of information that the press either reports or, frankly, is very interested in. They view that as just academics. However, it is fair to say that just coming together as a system does not automatically make an organization either more cost-effective or more quality-effective. What has to happen, whether in an independent hospital or in a system of hospitals, is what Dr. Hansen's been speaking about. We need to look at every process that exists in running a hospital. Dr. Hansen spoke, I thought, eloquently about the clinical processes. There are other processes that we need to look at as well. So I think there's a reason to be skeptical that merely changing an organizational form from independent hospitals to systems of hospitals, that automatically somehow the water gets better and the sun shines more. It doesn't happen. But when integration can occur and when clinical process improvement can occur, it will then spread across a system of hospitals. So rather than doing it 10 different ways in 10 different hospitals, we're now developing order sets that apply across a system. So, but it takes integration, it takes process improvement, and we're not there yet.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that, Don. Britta, it looks like the next question is aimed at you. It says, So can you explain what tools were used to obtain data on care process variation, and then how, from a governance standpoint, how did the practicing physicians become motivated to change their practice patterns, which is often hard to do?
Yeah, thanks. So, a lot of the examples I showed you were straight from our LogicStream software platform, and so we have the capability to do this analysis with our customers. So essentially, that's where you saw that coming from. But secondly, to be able to kind of support the teams and how to do this, I think that is another key factor here. So there are a lot of things that can be done around kind of governance structures within organizations, and mostly I would say people tend to get kind of worried about the overall concept of data governance, and I think, again, that is less and less needed when you start moving away from things like attribution and looking for kind of exceptions to care. And instead, but I do think there is a role for governance, and it's more around kind of how you manage your EHR content and who decides what the standard is and who turns things off that is not standard. So I think we have seen a lot of very helpful models of that. I believe very strongly that this needs to have clinician governance. This is an area where we need to move away from the siloed idea of IT versus clinical, and instead embrace our EHRs as a clinical tool and allow our clinicians to have oversight over what is our standard of care and what can we turn off if it's not standard.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dr. Hansen. So keeping on the topic of best practice adoption, another question is, what strategies or actions would help care providers better leverage their data to assist in best practice adoption?
Britta, you want to take
that?
that?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. So again, I think that kind of the way we analyze our care processes is we need to look at it differently. And one thing that could be particularly powerful is the concept, again, of looking at our this data within the context of peer groups. I just can't overstate enough how powerful I have found this over time. I know that when we start down this road and we start talking about it, there immediately comes a lot of defensiveness that any way we start analyzing our practices, that it's going to start leading to blame or pointing out those who have the poor outcomes or poor performance. But instead, I think we all are, come to work every day to do the right thing and to deliver the best care we can. And it is truly can be empowering when we see our own practice habits within the context of a meaningful peer group. And so I think that's one example, one key that can be helpful there.
Great, thank you again for sharing. So it looks like we have time for about one more question. And Don, I'll direct this one to you. And it reads, it reads, Don mentioned that it will likely be difficult for community and rural hospitals to remain independent. I have spoken to many large system CEOs who say they do not know how to work with governing bodies and leadership in these specific types of hospitals because the operations are a bit different from large systems. What would you suggest to overcome this challenge?
Well, certainly there have been a lot of independent hospitals that have very successfully come into a system and actually accelerated their outcomes, their growth, and so on. So it certainly is possible. I think one of the things is, when you spoke of governance and medical staff, is to have an appropriate governance structure in that system. I think what we have found over the history of systems, and they go back now 50, 60 years, so it's not something that's brand new. What we found over that is that having representational governance, that is, a governance structure at the system level where every entity is represented with a or two board members, just doesn't work. No board member is there in a representation governance structure, looking out for the system as a whole. John is there looking out for Hospital A. Martha is there looking out for Hospital B. Chuck is there looking out for Hospital C. There isn't any system governance. And those that maintain that you have to have representation from every operating unit, I think really have difficulty fitting into a system. So I think the governance structure is important, and certain structures work better than others. Medical staffs continue to operate, I think, very successfully in two ways in a system. One is the local responsibilities of physicians with regard to quality of medical care in that institution, and then contributing to how we integrate our hospital into the rest of the system. If we have a heart institute, for example, in the major city, how can we relate to that? How can we benefit our patients out here with the abilities and characteristics of that heart institute? What do we do to do that? So I think there's been plenty of success in this area, but a lot of it is built around the willingness of people to change, both the system and the individual hospital. And, you know, there aren't a lot of people who just enjoy change. We need to work on that for sure.
Thanks, Don. I think that's really a great point. So I'd like to end with one more question. And Dr. Hansen and Don, I'd love for you to both weigh in. And the question is, it was mentioned that there was cost savings by finding over-treatment areas, such as the medication or lab order examples presented during the webinar. Was a cost savings number found before or after the improvement? Sometimes the difficulty is getting the cost saving number to present to the C-suite to influence change and gain support. So do you have any insights to make it easier to give cost saving data on projects?
Well, why don't I go ahead and start? And I know, Don, your group has a lot of expertise in this area, so I'll let you weigh in next. But just to answer the start of that question, you know, that the numbers I quoted were the change from the time before the intervention till after. And I'd say in the cases that I mentioned where it's actual, you know, savings of tests and things that we know were unnecessary, that's relatively easy to calculate the return on investment there, because you can just see pure cost savings from not doing something that you shouldn't have done in the first place. However, I also mentioned that that's only the tip of the iceberg, and I will acknowledge it's just tremendously more complex to start capturing all of those downstream costs that you avoided by not doing the wrong thing in the first place. So that's just one category where we see some ROI. I know many of you probably listening do a lot of work around quality improvement. And again, there's a lot of additional complexity around calculating that return on investment in order to present to your leadership. Because not only, again, there's often cost savings around individual cases of things you prevented. So if you prevent a blood clot or you prevent a surgical site infection, that is absolutely some cost savings. But again, in our increasing move to value-based payment models, we also know that an even bigger piece of financial risk is the potential loss to your value-based reimbursement. So again, these become increasingly complex to calculate, but there is indeed ways to present this. And I know, Don, you have a lot of expertise in this as well.
I think the C-suite is looking for others' experience as well as what this project might be. So one of the things the C-suite will ask is, has this kind of a project, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as what you're proposing, has it been done elsewhere? And if so, what were those results? Now, most of the people conducting the studies are linked with a lot of people across the country, across their own organization. So it's not really that difficult to say, well, at our peer group hospitals, A, B, C, and D, you know, they've done something similar, and here were their results. So it doesn't always have to be a proposed cost study some experience in doing similar things or exactly the same kind of clinical process improvement task that has been done elsewhere, and give the C-suite some idea of what they can expect in terms of outcome. So I think we've got the tools to do that if we ask the right questions.
Fantastic. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank Don and Dr. Hansen for their excellent presentation and to our audience for participating. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.